In fact, unless they succumb to a predator, animals in the wild complete this process automatically. They encounter a threat, they successfully defend themselves, and then they recover completely afterwards. Each time through this cycle, they add to their toolbox of survival skills, and they widen their window. In humans, however, because we have a thinking brain that can override this automatic process controlled by the survival brain and nervous system, we often impede this recovery process. By now, given all we've covered so far, it should be clear that recovery is not up to the thinking brain. Recovery is a survival brain and autonomic nervous system job. And the survival brain will only turn on recovery functions when it neurocepts safety.
That is researcher Elizabeth Stanley from her online program Mindfulness-Based Mind Fitness Training. This Creative Mind audio episode is an excerpt from the Untangle podcast hosted by Patricia Karpus, who starts by asking Dr. Stanley about her personal journey into her writings and teachings on trauma recovery and resilience.
I'm going to talk to you today about your book, Widen the Window, which is just so chock full of amazing information that can be so helpful to any of us along the stress to trauma continuum. But I'd love to start with what inspired you to do this work. And I know this is a lot because I think this has been your story since you were a little girl. But will you share with us a little bit about what inspired you along the way?
I really think of this book as a labor of love. I came to this work through my own history on the stress and trauma continuum. And in many ways, this book is the culmination of an arc of experiencing a range of different stressful and traumatic experiences, and then the downstream effects of that, and then some recovery. So I was exhibit A of Widen the Window as I was living it myself. But I grew up in an alcoholic household and experienced other early life childhood adversity, sexual violence. And then I served in the military and I was overseas, so stressful military training, 2 deployments to the Balkans. I had a near-death experience in Bosnia. And after that, left active duty. And while I was in graduate school, all the effects of, at that point, many decades of coping the way most of us in our culture have been socialized to cope, which is to say, I just shoved that shit under. I suppressed, I compartmentalized, and I would just keep powering through. And that works really well in the short term. And our institutions are very much set up around incentivizing that behavior. But my body really bore the burden of that denial. By the time I was in my mid to late 20s, I was dealing with chronic insomnia. I had chronic respiratory infections and asthma while I was overseas. I developed PTSD and depression. And eventually I lost my eyesight when I was on the first year on the tenure track at Georgetown. And it was that finally got my attention. Trying to be a professor who couldn't see was what finally woke me up. And it took quite a long time to even understand what was going on with that. Turns out I had Lyme disease. I had bitten by a tick at that point over a decade prior, but they didn't know what was going on until many, many years later. But that was what got my attention. And that started me on, at this point, more than 20 years of a healing journey, extensive experience with mindfulness practice, both here and in Burma. I did some clinical training and body-based trauma therapies. I started as a client and realized, oh, this is really needed for complementing what I'd like to do. And so I actually did the clinical training and supervision and got certified in that and developed mindfulness-based mind fitness training, which is a resilience training program. I first took it to a military setting, which was what I knew. And since then, it has been offered in many, many different high stress, high demand professional contexts, and individuals who are working or living in high stress conditions or traumatic conditions. And we're working right now with people in Ukraine to share it too. So